Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program, and welcome and thank you for tuning in. We have a very unusual guest, someone I met a few months ago, someone I've known about, Mohamed with us today. And we're going to discuss very openly and very candidly, not pulling our punches, the realities of the situation in today's Middle East and the realities as they are reflected in Washington about today's Middle East. Mohamed, thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed our first encounter when we were part of a panel discussion, but today we get to talk one-on-one. And as you know, I found your comments about the Washington scene as well as the Middle East extremely illuminating. I'd like to ask you just to tell our viewers something about yourself, your background, how long you've been in Washington, what you've been doing, your connection to the mosque here, and don't be humble. Let us have it.
Okay, I have a little mixed background in the sense that second-generation American, parents originally from that general area called the Holy Land, whatever the nation-state designation of it is, and it happens to be, in my case, Lebanon and Syria. I went to college and high school in Lebanon before the days of what had become the civil war there. Then I went, of course, came back here to the United States, went to college here, and subsequently became the elected Imam of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C.
Okay, you were the first and only elected Imam.
That is absolutely correct.
And this is in the early 80s.
The election took place the last Friday of November 1981.
But I think you've skipped, as I recall your history, we've only spoken a few times, you were also in the American military.
That's right, I was in the Air Force. I did my 4 years, and I got stationed at Andrews Air Force Base, and that's how I more or less settled into this area.
Mm-hmm. And now what did you do in those 4 years?
Well, I was a medic in at Andrews Air Force Base. Anyways, to make these things, skipping a lot of these details, when I got elected to become the Imam or the director of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C.
For those who don't know, this is a very prominent structure building on Embassy Row on Massachusetts Avenue. We're one of the few cities, it must have been one of the first mosques in the United States. In the last 10, 15 years, more have been built.
Well, you can say it was one of the first mosques to be built here. It wasn't the first. I think the first was out in Iowa somewhere. Mm-hmm. But this one was the most monumental mosque in the United States. It was inaugurated by President Eisenhower in 1957. They began building it, though, in the early 50s. And anyways, the practice in that mosque up until those elections was that a group of ambassadors would sit together and then they would choose who the director of the center is. And that practice was in effect until our elections. And when we decided, the concerned Muslims in this area, the Muslims who go and congregate there, decided to have elections, of course, that irritated first and foremost the Saudi ambassador at the time. There was weak opposition from the other ambassadors. There's a committee of 7 ambassadors that are elected on a 2-year basis.
So what basically happened was the congregants themselves, the people coming to the mosque, said, why should we have the ambassador choosing our leader when we can choose our leader ourselves?
Exactly.
Pretty reasonable, especially here in America.
It seems like it's the American way.
And when you mentioned the Saudi ambassador, that was already Ambassador Bandar, or was it Al-Hajlan at the time?
At that time, it was Al-Hajlan. Mm-hmm. This was about a year before Bandar became ambassador.
So their embassy was still on 18th Street. Al-Hajlan and his wife was still fairly low-key and unpretentious.
That's right.
That's all changed in the last few years, and we'll be talking about His Excellency Ambassador Bandar later in this program. You can't wait, I see.
So we had these elections, and the elected body of Muslims, the new administration was there in the center for about a year and a half. And then after that, all of a sudden, this was March 5th, 1983, forces came in and they undid or they quashed the
Forces? What do you mean forces?
Well, we had security forces. We had the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Force, vigilante forces. I mean, there was an assortment, probably around 200 different types of law enforcement personnel who that morning came to the center and basically closed it.
Well, other than choosing your own leaders, what was it you did to provoke the Arab ambassadors? This is '83, so it's just a year after the trauma of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in '82.
Yeah, I think what really irritated these ambassadors was that the congregation on Friday, I don't think they would have been irritated if there was no congregation in the mosque. But the problem is, in the weekly congregation on Friday, the sermon now was a free sermon. It no longer towed the line of...
they didn't write it.
Yeah, they didn't write it.
Or prove it.
Dictated, and they didn't...
so you could actually speak...
your conscience.
And I assume in that, because I remember that period well, the trauma of the '82 situation created a lot of anxiety.
That's right.
A lot of negative commentary about the state of the Arab world.
That's absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
And people, they had latent feelings, they had a lot of inner thoughts, and they needed someone to express them. And this new elected administration was the type that was willing to express the thoughts and the feelings of this congregation.
Which is why they elected you, I assume.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, you know, as I said, we don't need to be humble in this program. The purpose of this discussion is to have an honest, freewheeling discussion about the real situation in Washington, the real situation in the Middle East that isn't available to Americans who watch normal American television. And we know why it's not available, because these same interests that threw you out of the mosque have pretty much got their hooks into the networks and into the PR and into the public relations firms, et cetera, and so reality doesn't sneak through very often. All right, so this is '83, you got thrown out on your ear. Since then, as I understand it, you and your congregants over a decade now have been praying on the street on Friday.
That's absolutely right.
You're not allowed into the mosque, so you come and you pray outside.
Every Friday, and also we have two major holidays in our calendar, the Islamic calendar, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. Those holiday prayers are also performed there in front of the Islamic Center on Massachusetts Avenue. And as you may know, there are snowy days in Washington, D.C., and there's sizzling days in the summer, and it doesn't matter. We're there, and we're praying, and we've been denied access to our mosque, our temple where we pray. And imagine this is taking place in a democratic country where elections are supposed to be highly prized.
Well, let's not get into that. Last night they were commenting that the Republican convention, and same is true for the Democratic, were choreographed very much similar to how the Communist Party used to choreograph its conferences. But that is too amorphous a subject. Let's talk about the Arab world and about Washington. You have been in Washington now for 15, 20 years?
I've been in Washington for 22 years.
All right. You've observed and participated in Arab American affairs. You know all the players, from the ambassadors to the PR groups to the lobbying organizations. Also, you retain a very close connection to the Arab world from which you come. Let's start with the state of the Arab world. We've talked about it before. I don't want to lead you too far. I want you to speak up about it. But basically, it's a series of client regimes in sort of an unholy relationship with the United States and Israel. And from one country after another, destruction or police states or things of that kind seem to be rolling through the region. With that much provocation, what's your view of the state of today's Arab world?
Well, the Arab world, we have to take a look at two segments of the Arab world. The first segment is the popular segment, the people's segment of the Arab world, where people live, the everyday life of individuals from Morocco to Iraq and from Sudan to Syria. These people are really disconnected from all the governments that purportedly represent them. There's no social contract between these people and the nation-state systems that are imposed on them in the aftermath of the First World War. The nation-state concept seeped into that area. There were no nation-states before the First World War.
Okay, I want to take us to the First World War because most of the viewers probably are not experts on the history of the region. Basically, it was the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Basically, the West came in under the guise of the League of Nations, carved the region up into artificial entities. That's where the origins of Iraq being separated from Kuwait can be found. Declared that this was the Paris Peace Conference in 1918, 1919. And as the most interesting book about that period reflects, the Paris Peace Conference was the peace to end all peace. There's never been peace since after what they did. So that is the title of David Fromkin's book. It's a fantastic book about this period. And he titled it The Peace to End All Peace. All right, so you trace the disconnect between popular feelings and desires and the desire for Arab nationalism and the desire for an Arab entity back to what the West did in Paris after World War I.
Absolutely, and let me also try to put this a little more in perspective. The leading powers that emerged triumphant in a Europe that defeated the Habsburgs and the Ottomans and the rest, these powers believed very, because of their own circumstances and their own type of history, talking about Europe now, they believed very sincerely in their nation-state concept, and they thought that this would be the most workable concept on the political and ideological level for the rest of the world. So they seeped out, the British, the French, they seeped out of their European context, and they went into the Middle East. They went with this, they went first of all as colonialist powers, and then as mandate powers, and they set up this nation-state structure throughout the Middle East that alienated the peoples, the Muslim peoples predominantly, and then the Christians there also, I think, because they share somewhat in the Middle Eastern context, even though some of them may feel more comfortable with Europe than they do with their brethren and neighbors. But nevertheless, this new structure was imposed politically and in an administrative sense on the whole area of the Middle East. And this was done, from my perspective, as a harbinger for setting up the State of Israel, because the State of Israel also is a nation-state concept.
Well, I was going to say the origins of the political Zionist movement are in this period as well. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 during the war to get, but in addition to setting up a caricature of the nation-state system that was prevalent in Europe, they did something else. They superimposed on the caricature of nation-states client regimes. At least in the West, the nation-states have some relationship to their society, some accountability to their society. The regimes that were imposed on the nation-states of the Middle East to this day have no accountability.
That's right, and that's what complicates it. Not only do the people disagree with the definition of the state that is ruling them, the nation-state concept, that has placed distances between people who basically are the same people. I mean, take for example myself. My father's from Syria, my mother's from Lebanon. Now what happened is, when the French were there as the mandate power, they drew this artificial line to expand the concept of Lebanon that was only the mountain, Mount Lebanon. That was a small territorial area, and they had to give it something expanded so it make it a functional nation state. So they sliced part of Syria off, and they drew this line. Now, what happened in my particular case, and I'm sure in many other cases, on the eastern side of this line is my father's town. On the western side of this line is my mother's town. But if you didn't know anything about politics and the nation-state setup in the Middle East, if you were illiterate and you were dropped in that area, or if you lived there like my grandfather and grandfathers, they'd say, we're the same people.
Fair enough. And the same, of course, was done. The Jordan River became the boundary between Transjordan and Palestine, even though the whole area was one contiguous area, as it was with Syria. All right. Most Americans, of course, don't realize that the origins of today's conflicts and tensions go back at least to this period, and that in the Middle East, 100 years is the thick of a moment. I mean, I walk around in Jerusalem. There's a friend of mine, a Palestinian friend, who has a home in the Old City, and it's not far from where the Little Wailing Wall is. And he jokes when we go by that these stones are only 500 years old, these stones that we're walking by on his way to his house. For people in this country, 500 years predates our entire civilization. So 100 years in the Middle East is the flick of a moment, even though when we sit here talking about it, 1918 seems a long time away. No question about it. I think you're absolutely right. But I asked you about today's Middle East, and history is terribly interesting, but people are gripped by the dynamics of the world in which they're living today. So when you view today's Middle East, what do you see?
I see that these rulers who have alienated themselves from their own peoples and who owe their allegiance to the power centers in Europe and in Washington, these rulers now are setting themselves up for a backlash that has been in the making. That's why I stepped back a little into the past. We have been witnessing, those of us who live this reality, whether we live it practically or mentally or observingly or researching it or whatever, we are witnessing right now the beginning of this backlash that is picking up its momentum against these rulers.
Now, specifics of this would be the revolution in Algeria, the attempt to elect an Islamic government, and then it was quelled by the military and the West.
That's right.
The tensions in Lebanon, what's happening in Turkey, the first non-secular government since the Ottoman breakup in Turkey.
Well, it's still secular, except it's being desecularized. Right now in Turkey, we're witnessing the first chapter of desecularizing Turkey.
All right, the Muslim Brotherhood, the tension in Egypt, the whole region is boiling. The bombs in Saudi Arabia. The interesting thing about the Americans went to Saudi Arabia under the guise of protecting it from another Arab power, but in reality the greater threats to Saudi Arabia today are the internal opposition that has arisen partly because of the Americans being there in the first place.
That's right. And what is most interesting about all of this is notice the Western press, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., or the magazines or journals that are supposed to be scholarly, etc. None of these have, or even in the Hebrew press. Now, the Hebrew state is in the middle of all of this. They're supposed to enjoy more freedom, at least in comparison. There's more freedom when it comes to Jewish editors, Jewish writers, and Jewish correspondents of the Israeli nation state. But what is their position vis-a-vis the developments in Algeria or in Egypt, these developments that are going to impact them sooner or later? I haven't heard, and I may stand to be corrected, but up until now, I haven't heard a free Jewish Israeli voice that supports a democratic process in Egypt, or a democratic process in Algeria, or a democratic process in Turkey.
You won't hear those voices because the Israeli establishment creates a situation where they exist, but they are not able to speak up and project themselves. But it's not much different. Here I am. I've got 3 advanced degrees, been to the Middle East 150 times, used to represent the World Jewish Congress, have a fairly extensive portfolio of articles and publications. I'm asked to appear on Canadian and BBC and other TVs, but rarely asked to appear on American TV. It's Jim Zogby and Prince Bandar and Khalil Jashan at NAAA. Those are the people who are asked to speak on behalf of Arab Americans, and they say about the same thing that Bill Clinton and the Israeli lobby say. You're not asked to appear. That's why we have this program. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program, and the program is Mideast Realities. We're on public access TV channels for the reasons that I'm discussing today with Mohamed Alassi. a gentleman I have known of for some years, but only met a few months ago. And it's true in the Middle East, it's true in Washington. Sometimes it seems like there's almost a perfect correlation between the more someone is an expert and independent and outspoken, the less likely that person is to appear on national media, be it print or TV. And let's not pull our punches, let's name the names. Judith Kipper, consultant for ABC. Fuad Ajami, projected as an Arab American spokesman on CBS, but I don't know any Arab American, even the Quisling groups, even the controlled groups wouldn't invite Fuad Ajami to anything. I don't think he's been at an Arab American function for 20 years. So let's talk about Washington and the scene here. The average American hears that there is an Israeli lobby, Jewish organizations, and there's an Arab lobby, Arab organizations. There's the ADC, the NAAA, the Arab American Institute of Zogby. Tell us about these groups and what they represent to you and to the people that you think are more authentic spokesmen.
Well, all of these that you alluded to, these lobbying groups and these types of organizations, especially since the late 70s and early 80s, that is a watershed in Middle Eastern history, there and here. Simply because in 1979, for the first time, we witnessed a revolution take place in the Middle East. I'm talking about the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Now, really right now is not the time to go into the details of that revolution, but I want to allude to it because it had its impact on the rest of the active and conscientious Muslims there and here. And it seemed like at the time there was a potential of Muslims, whether they are Arabs or non-Arabs, and we have plenty of them here in the United States of both sides. They were on the verge of beginning to establish the types of organizations and the types of associations that would speak for them and reflect the reality as it is here and as it is there in the Middle East.
So they were energized not so much by the Islamic Revolution, but by the idea that a despotic Shah, a client regime, could be thrown out by popular will.
Yeah, well, I would say by both. First of all, there was and has been since then an Islamic conscience that has been fermenting in the Middle East. When the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place, it gave a boost, like you said, your word was very accurate, it energized this whole context. And that was bound to have its echo here in the United States among the different Muslims who are here.
Would it be correct to say Islamic energization combined with Arab nationalist energization? I was just coined a word here. But in addition to the fact that it has religious origins, doesn't it also have nationalist origins? Let's get rid of these regimes that don't represent us, that are controlled by the CIA and by Washington. Let's have our own elected officials, just like the decision to elect an imam at your mosque.
Well, as far as I can't speak for Arab nationalists, but as far as those who believe in Arab nationalism as an ideology, I think reading their moves, no, that would not be the case, because Arab nationalists had governments in the Middle East that in one sense or the other